Today's video is going to be all about the settings and process that I use for recording my GoPro videos. In this video, I'll be covering the gear I bring with me, what you can do aside from camera settings to improve your videos, as well as my use of the camera settings and ND filters and how they work together. I'll be referring to the settings and use of my GoPro Hero 8. But most HD action cameras will have the same settings and ND filters available. The gear I use is pretty straightforward. There's not much to it. The GoPro, obviously, I usually bring a second spare camera, the one I'm recording on right now. And then a charging cable for a battery charger. I always have a spare battery, so there's one charging while I'm using another one in the GoPro. So I always have a charged one ready to go. Just a cable for it and a USB power bank. This one I think is, it says it's 5,000 milliamp hours. I find I can charge my GoPro about 3 times off of this from close to dead. Another really important thing is to have lots of extra SD cards. When you go and do a flight, you don't want to you don't want to use a really big, say 128 gigabyte SD card and then just do 3, 4, 5 flights on it. You want to use a small one, like I always get 32 gig cards. Do one flight and then swap the card out. That way if something goes wrong with the card or you happen to lose your quad in the GoPro, at least you've got all the other stuff safe. I like to always have an ND 8, 16, and 32 with me. I like these camera butter stick-on ones. It's just got this little sticky sort of gasket around the edge that holds it onto the screen. I'll see if I can find a link for this thing, and I'll include it in the description for this little SD card holder that I 3D printed. I found it on Thingiverse. And I guess I will I'll also put a link in the description for this. It's just a pretty cheap charger for the GoPro batteries, but it's always worked fine for me. So I'll link that in the description as well. With a little planning ahead of time, you can set yourself up for better videos by considering sunlight, time of day, weather, location, and allowing some time to practice. The sunlight and time of day part is pretty straightforward. It's just like photography. In the middle of the day, there's going to be a lot more glare and haze. You're going to see less color, and there'll be a lack of contrast within the video. Closer to sunrise or sunset, there's going to be a lot less glare and haze in the sky. You're going to get more color in your video. There is the downside, though, that it's more likely to encounter some poorly lit areas as you're flying across the landscape. As for the weather, I like to always plan in advance and watch the forecast for several days, just so I can see if there's any trends in the weather. If the weekend that I'm planning on going flying, it looks like the weather's starting to get worse and worse over the week, then maybe I'll just call it and say, oh, I'm going to try going next weekend or the weekend after. Because there's no point in putting all this planning into things and then just going out and trying to fly and get some good video on a crappy weather day. You're going to capture some much better video with good sunlight. And remember, if you plan on flying in the mountains, the weather will always have an element of unpredictability to it. For a flight location, it's really worth spending some time checking out potential spots to fly. So it's really worth spending some time looking through Google Maps or Google Earth and trying to find 2 good spots nearby each other. So if one of them doesn't work out, then you've always got a backup one. And just like anything, the more you practice, the better you'll do. For most of us, it'll take more than one flight to get some nice footage. Plan on doing the same flight 2 or 3 times. This way you can learn the best flight path and also plan out shots that you want to get on your next flight. Now I'll go through a description of some of the settings and how I use them along with ND filters to get better GoPro footage. Bitrate. The bitrate should always be set to high. For the GoPro Hero 8, low is either 45 or 60 megabits per second, and high is 100 megabits per second. A higher bitrate records more of the information from the image sensor. A lower bitrate sacrifices image quality to reduce the file size. Frame rate. GoPros as well as many other action cameras use the same bitrate for both 30 FPS and 60 FPS video. This doesn't mean that a 60 FPS video is half the quality of a 30 FPS video, but 30 FPS does have a noticeably better image quality to it. .30 FPS is best if you want motion blur in your video, but sometimes 60 FPS will look a bit smoother. Shutter speed. The shutter speed dictates how long the image sensor is exposed to light for each frame of video. The longer the duration, the more motion blur will be seen in the video. A shorter shutter speed will reduce motion blur and sometimes make for a sharper looking result. It can also make the video look choppy, especially with a lower frame rate. Now, what do I use the different settings for? Here's some examples. 30 FPS with a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second is best for flying in close along a mountain ridgeline or diving a cliff, for instance, or flying low and fast while following along a river. 30 FPS with a shutter speed of 1/120th of a second is better for slightly sharper image with less motion blur in it. It's good to use when there's a lot of motion in your video, or when you're flying higher up and trying to include more of the surroundings and want them to show up nice and crisp. Then, like I'd mentioned before, a frame rate of 60 FPS and shutter speed of 1/120th of a second is going to work best if you're planning on adjusting your playback speed of your video at all in post. Otherwise, I find that 30 FPS video just looks better and is nicer to watch. Now, how do the camera settings and ND filters work together? Well, frame rate and shutter speed also control the exposure of the video. But we want to use these settings to control the look of the video instead. So an ND filter is used to control the exposure. In the examples below, you can see the difference with and without an ND filter when we're using the specific settings we want to use. In this case, 30 FPS and a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. And now I'll go through the process of setting up the camera and using an ND filter. You start off with entering the specific settings, the frame rate and shutter speed that you want to use on your camera. Then go through your ND filters and select the best filter for the exposure you want. And finally, you can fine-tune this by adjusting the min and max ISO settings. And I'll go through that with you now. GoPros have a minimum and maximum setting for ISO. If you want the exposure to stay the exact same for the whole flight, then set min and max ISO to the same number. But if you'll be flying through shadows and sunlit areas, you may want to use a range of ISO, for instance, a minimum of 100 and a maximum of 800. This will allow the camera to automatically select the appropriate ISO level while it stays within the range that you've specified. Auto exposure. Sometimes light differences are so great that it's easier to get good results by using an appropriate ND filter and just setting the shutter speed to auto. Sometimes I'll do this if I'll be flying, for instance, a shaded waterfall and a sunlit snowy peak in the same flight. There's no way to get to lock the exposure and get the settings just right to be able to have both of those turn out properly exposed in the same video. So putting on an ND16 and then setting the camera to auto, or possibly an ND8 if the shadowed area is particularly dark. And then just letting the camera adjust the settings itself. It doesn't give you quite as much control over the particular look that you'll be getting in the video, but at least the footage will all show up. For the lens selection, you can choose between super view, wide, linear, and narrow, as well as the aspect ratio of 16:9 or 4:3. I always use wide for my videos, but linear may also be a good option. Super view, on the other hand, has too much fisheye effect and does not work well with real steady, and is also not available in the 4:3 option. And for aspect ratio, choose 4:3 if you plan on using real steady, or 16:9 if you don't plan on using any stabilization in post. So I always use wide 4:3, and then if I happen to not use any stabilization, I can always just crop the 4:3 to 16:9. Depending on the model of the GoPro, there is also an option to have the camera use a specific portion of the screen, called spot metering, to decide the exposure level. This can come in handy if clouds are backlit by the sun. With bright clouds in the sky, the camera will drop the exposure quite a bit, making everything on the ground look dark. You can position the spot meter box over the ground, making the camera expose the video based on light levels within that desired area. For color, I always use the flat color profile. The option GoPro color often looks oversaturated. The flat color profile still records nice bright colors when there's good lighting and use the white balance setting correctly. As was recommended in many videos, I used to always use native for the white balance and then correct it in post. But I've found, in my opinion, using a native white balance results in a video with very dull color that is difficult to fix in post. Using the auto setting for white balance can work well for videos that have consistent lighting conditions or with minimal landscape changes. The auto setting will, however, occasionally be way off. My secret to nice looking colors is to look at what the auto setting looks like and then choose a white balance level that gives the same look. This way the white balance will remain locked at that particular setting rather than constantly changing throughout the video like it does when you put it on auto. Improve your odds. The more flights you record, the more likely you are to get the footage you're hoping for. It can make for a long and tiring day out flying, but it's often worth the effort to record 4 or 5 flights rather than 2 or 3. The more work you put into it, the better your results will be.